The Chrysanthemums by John Steinbeck is a short story about a middle-aged woman, Alyssa, discovering her worth as a woman in the 1920s. Alyssa lives on a farm with her husband in Salinas Valley, where she takes pride in her ability to grow beautiful chrysanthemums. One day while her husband is away, a man with a wagon shows up at Alyssa's farm. He tries to get her to pay him to fix household items, but when she is unwilling, he asks for some of her chrysanthemums instead. Alyssa, ecstatic that he is interested in her talent, not only gives him the flowers, but also pays him to fix some old pots. Afterwards, while on the way into town with her husband, they pass the wagon man, and Alyssa sees that he has dumped her chrysanthemums on the road and has stolen the pot she put them in. The flowers represent Alyssa's worth as a woman in the 1920s, and the male characters in the story represent society's lack of acknowledgement for her abilities.
On first read, the piece was very confusing. There were a lot of underlying themes that we didn't really understand. Alyssa Allen seemed to be longing for something that her husband couldn't or wouldn't give her. It is apparent that the meaning of the story depends on whose perspective the reader could identify with. Alyssa Allen wanted to be acknowledged as a valued member of her family. The men in the story, Henry Allen and the wagon man, don't see Alyssa in the way she would like. The text is saying that a person's worth is not based on sex, but on what they can do. Alyssa is very strong and able to achieve many things, but isn't allowed to because of society and the men around her. Society determines the value and worth of things by those in power controlling and limiting others. For example, Alyssa's husband controls her by not allowing her to do real farm work, and the wagon man exploits her by pretending to be interested in her talent. Alyssa tends to her chrysanthemums as if they are the children she is missing. Her husband doesn't take into account that she might be able to do other work on the farm besides keeping a flower garden. She feels very stuck and closed off, much like her garden with the fence around it. When with her husband, Alyssa has to portray a very different side of herself. It is as if, when trimming her chrysanthemums, she is trimming the parts of herself that don't fit within society's standards.
Over the course of the story, Alyssa develops an understanding of her place in the social hierarchy of the 1920s. At the beginning of the story, she takes pride in her place on the farm. She is satisfied despite not being responsible for any real farm work or being part of the business decisions that her husband makes. However, by the end of the story, Alyssa realizes that she is strong and smart enough to do the same work as her husband, and the fact that he never asks or expects her to do this work upsets her. She has realized that despite her personal capabilities, she will never be on the same level as her husband because the society they live in dismisses her worth simply because she is a woman. John Steinbeck's writing style uses descriptive words and metaphors to paint a vivid image for the reader, but his tone and the mood of the story convey a feeling of indifference. There is no overarching positive or negative feeling, but the story has a sense of disinterest and an uninviting atmosphere. Steinbeck uses phrases like gray flannel fog, pale cold sunshine, and it was a time of quiet and waiting to create suspense and a foreboding impression. Steinbeck also uses a lot of symbolism in his writing. For example, the chrysanthemums represent Alyssa's worth, and the scene in which Alyssa dresses up and puts on makeup represents how she feels she must change in order to be accepted as a woman in society. Some important ideas that Abik Métis brings up in their analysis of the chrysanthemums is Steinbeck's portrayal of women. In Steinbeck's writing, Métis points out that women are often shown as alienated, strong-willed, lonely, and indestructible, among other traits which challenge the traditional stereotypes of women at the time. Another topic that Métis brings up is the lonely world where the chrysanthemums takes place. This version of the Salinas Valley has an isolated atmosphere, which causes Alyssa to be closed off from her dreams and desires. This leads Alyssa to create the garden as a place where she can be herself, and by pruning and caring for the flowers, she is in a way protecting herself. John Steinbeck is from Salinas Valley in the Monterey Peninsula, California. He believed in both conservative and radical policies and went to Stanford for less than 3 years while working many blue-collar jobs. This allowed him to gain respect for the people who worked those jobs continuously. Steinbeck moved to Pacific Grove to continue writing while relying on his parents for money for many years before becoming successful. He devoted his writing to show the struggles of oppressed peoples, and while at first his books were banned for radical ideas, they were later celebrated and made into films. Steinbeck won a Pulitzer Prize for Grapes of Wrath in 1940 and a Nobel Peace Prize in 1962 for his work overall, when women had few freedoms or rights and could express themselves only in very limited ways. Women were thought to be inferior to men because they were weaker, more emotional, and better suited to running the household or caring for children than for many paying jobs. This is the situation that the main character of the Chrysanthemums is in. Alyssa cannot escape from her life on the farm and can express herself only through growing chrysanthemums because all the male characters do not believe she is fit for any other form of work. This is what causes conflict around Alyssa's worth, because although she sees herself as smart and strong, the historical context places her in a position where she is limited by the societal expectations of women.
The Chrysanthemums was published in 1937. The 30s were a particularly difficult time for Americans. From the Great Depression to the Dust Bowl, life was hard and resources were scarce. When thousands of farmers lost their livelihoods, many migrated to Salinas Valley from the Plain States. In 1937, Franklin D. Roosevelt was in his second term as president, providing rescue from the failed policies of his predecessor, President Hoover. 1937 was the year Amelia Earhart disappeared while attempting to be the first woman to fly around the world. Women had only received the right to vote a decade before, in the 20s. Women were finding their voice in many ways, but were still very sheltered. John Steinbeck was known for his sometimes radical views on many different topics. Salinas Valley had a large immigrant population, most of them working on farms. He wrote about their plight as migrant workers and their struggles dealing with difficult and malicious farm owners. In 1939, Steinbeck published The Grapes of Wrath, a story about a family traveling to find a better life, which was banned and burned in many states because of its supposed radicalism.